scenario that you just created, as you just spoke about, says that power has framed the debate, right? And so as long as you allow power to frame the debate, there's this hierarchy that is assumed. And as I said at the beginning, when it comes to the artistic voice is there to ask all of those questions and all the difficult questions, because it's in pursuit of honesty and in pursuit of these human connections that make us feel like, A, we're not alone, and also that we're connected to reality. Because when a veteran comes back from war, I'm sure that the trauma is that they were duped. This was a hell. They were forced to go into hell. And what do you do when you are put onto the battlefield and you're forced to engage in hell? The only way to survive fire like that is if you behave like a demon. It's the only thing that you can do. Now, if that becomes your survival mechanism on the battlefield, and then you are taken off of the battlefield and put back into civilian life, all of a sudden, it must be true that you recognize this ability to abandon your humanity in order to survive in hell, and now you're not in hell anymore. What are you? What do you do with that? So the arts were always there to say, to give you a space to expose this pain, this sorrow, this sadness, because
so
it's only.
I want to ask, do you think that that's actually a product of the left being in the belly of the imperialist core capitalist beast of America? In other words, I think we would all agree that in the 30s and 40s, early 20th century, maybe late 19th century, we had a serious left that was such a threat to bourgeois capital that massive concessions had to be given vis-a-vis the New Deal. Right. And labor, the 5-day work week, weekends, except 8-hour work day, etc.
Yeah.
But do you think that in the post-war era of the liberal democratic expanse, where America kind of became the global hegemon, that the idea of producing a real left of that sort is kind of obsolete?
Yeah, because I think that what happened after the Second World War in particular was the coalescence of power to just the upper echelons of the hierarchy, which has a right wing and a left wing, but it's still part of the elite. And so how do you get people to refrain from attacking the upper echelon of the hierarchy and attack the elite? Is to say, you are part of my team, right? If you're a left Democrat, all of a sudden, being left remarkably became you belong to the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. And so it relinquishes any responsibility that you have to be uncomfortable, which is what activism is about, and what naming what is criminal about the system is about, because there's penalties for that. Right? And people don't want to be made uncomfortable, particularly after the Second World War, when the entire planet was almost destroyed. And I think that it's a key thing to also recognize, and a lot of what the book is about, is what happened to the voice of that population that came out of after the Second World War, where parents and younger people basically. Well, let me say it this way. I think the circumstances of the Second World War were the result of people playing follow the leader, and assuming that the people who were in charge had their best interests at heart. Right. So when it's demonstrated that is not the case, you come out of that situation. It becomes an existential anxiety that you have to examine. And what do you use to examine in a very honest and truthful way? You utilize poetry, you utilize the arts community, because the arts community is there to communicate concerns while elbowing out of the way bullshit. And power and politicians rely on bullshit and what that does as far as shutting down communication. Right. So now you've got this population that is used to a degree in having their voices at least heard, because people wanted to communicate in private spaces and also in spaces where congregation was allowed to happen, say around newsstands, for example. remember, we're talking about a time when the majority of the news was being there was the dominant culture had mainstream news sources, obviously, but there were any number of alternative news sources and various organizations that were attempting to name the problems of power. You know, the Communist Party had a voice. That was accessible by the general public, because we're talking about newsstands that produced information with a morning edition and a night edition. And so workers were accessing newsstands that had these publications next to each other. So you had more of an opportunity to get a wider range of opinion. And inside of that opinion were voices that weren't being sanctioned by power, that were self-generating and supporting themselves with subscription money and just donations.
Wow. Well, I mean, I would argue that possibly with the evisceration of print media, consolidation of telecommunications, that kind of ideological diversity in print publication is pretty much kind of evaporated. So
completely.
With that being the case, how does that affect? Well, I want to ask you a larger question, is that the argument that culture and art are tools for revolutionary change is something that we hear, particularly in kind of left Marxist circles, you know, Castro, Amilcar Cabral, even Mao, the Cultural Revolution. It's kind of a part of the overall ethos of the left. I've always wondered the kind of culture as revolution and art as revolution within the American kind of last 50 years, how in a capitalist society that comes in at such an early stage of production, is the capacity of culture and art to be revolutionary really still possible? Particularly, I think of people when my generation, the early hip-hop generation, talking about hip-hop is the vanguard of the revolution for Black youth. And I always thought that was kind of crap, because quite frankly, hip-hop from its earliest production interfaces with capitalist mechanisms. So I'd like to hear from you as an artist who, you know, tries to create radical art. How do you get through that conundrum, or do you think it's something that makes it almost difficult for art and or cultural production to be radical revolutionary?
Yeah, you absolutely nailed it, because that is particularly when you look at how, 5 mega corporations that control all of the platforms from which information flows in this country, where 25 years ago it was maybe 53 corporations. And that's just, we're talking about the corporate model. Add to that, as I was just saying, private platforms that don't even fit into the discussion. There were lots. But it's true that now it's impossible, just for myself, for the last 10 years, you know, before that, there was still some version of an alternative press limping along, for sure, but people were still accessing it. Whether we're talking about Z Magazine, Mother Jones still had a viable voice. Harper's Magazine had was able to get some sort of artistic communication inside while still being a little bit of a boutique-y type of magazine. The Nation had, I would argue, greater viability. But then you also had the Village Voice, and you had the small remaining ring of alternative press still functioning. With the eradication of that, it is definitely true, as an artist, where is one supposed to go in order to have his or her work seen by the general public? You have now, the corporate model is such that you have to access these platforms if you want to make a living, because that's really part of that has to be one of the major parts of this discussion, because we've really eliminated the middle class. It doesn't really exist anymore. Where if you just look back, starting 40 years ago and previous to that, there was still something of a middle class where an artist could work at a coffee shop, could work at a bookstore, could make sandwiches for a certain portion of the day and still support him or herself and produce art and have that disseminated somehow into the culture. Now what we're left with, and this is why it's really terribly sad, there's very little encouraging advice that I can give to younger artists who want to communicate these ideas that I think are important, because they have to go. The only platforms that they can approach really in order to make a living are these corporate platforms. Now, a corporate platform, they don't see an audience members as people that you want to engage with and to bring into the conversation and have meaningful discourse about politics and culture. They see them as consumers. And so what do you do with consumers? What you do with consumers is that you do not, the consumer is always right. The model is to dumb down the content so you don't offend anybody, and by connection to that, advertisers. You get into this shitty situation where all of a sudden, one of the major things that you cannot say as an artist, and it's probably the most important thing that you need to say as a viable artist, is that corporations are bullshit. Capitalism has to be examined and seen for for the atrocities that it perpetuates. What corporation is going to allow that messaging in? None. So all of a sudden, you're trapped as an artist, and there's plenty of people that I know, because mind you, that the artistic voice and using art to produce commentary about life predates magazines and newspapers. We're always out there. We're always going to be communicating. Whether we're going to be seen by a large public that can then utilize the seriousness and power of this kind of conversation to actually exert social and political change is another thing. And that's really what we all should be talking about, in how to politicize the culture in a way that doesn't allow power to frame all of the conversations and establish the arenas wherein we can have these discussions. Because I think that's where we are right now. And that's why things suck so bad, because we're allowing power to frame the conversations. And you can't win if that's the case. You just absolutely can't win. So we've got to sort of muscle our way into a situation where we're able to communicate in a way that says, fuck the power. You know, they don't have our best interest at heart, because they're trying to protect this hierarchy that keeps them at the top. And they're making sure that capital and profit is flowing in one direction. Those are not the people who should be determining what moral conversations we should be having, or, you know, what is a respectable way to live. They're the worst people.
To hear the rest of this show and more, you can find us at This Is Revolution Podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Podbean, Pandora, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, you can find a new episode every Wednesday on the Zero Books YouTube channel. This is Revolution.